Hello, my name is Tanya Verquin, the host of Pixelated Perspectives podcast and host of the online membership community New Perspectives. And on behalf of the GHK Foundation, it is my pleasure to offer this brief video exploring tracks, everything tracks. So primary tracks, secondary tracks, extended tracks, why and how they develop, and also suggestions on how to begin identifying and moving beyond tracks. So you might be wondering, well, why would this be important for me to understand? And the reason is because tracks are really the reason we have any sort of chronic condition. If we experience any sort of chronic recurring condition like rashes or allergies or, seizures ongoing, or any sort of so-called chronic disease, it is due to tracks. That is the cause. That is the reason we still have ongoing symptoms. And so it is helpful to understand tracks so that we can start to consciously make changes around them. So in order to best understand these tracks, it's going to be very important to understand primarily the first biological law of nature, which explains the cause of all known disease to man, right? Any sort of health condition we experience is explained through the biological law, the first biological law. That seemingly symptoms come from nowhere, right? So this is the exception of, this wouldn't include an injury. So the biological law of nature wouldn't be applying for an injury, a broken arm due to a fall, or you getting poisoned, or severe malnutrition. So apart from those three exceptions, these biological laws of nature explain how and why we will experience any sort of biological response in our bodies. And again, the track is what causes recurring symptoms in our bodies. So a track is simply an early warning signal that is established the moment someone experiences a DHS or a conflict shock. So this is the first biological law, right? That we experience the moment we experience a conflict shock, something that catches us off guard, that we weren't prepared for, that's highly acute, dramatic, and we are isolated in that moment. That is what begins this special biological program in the body. So we have, in that very split second, the subconscious perceives very subjectively the situation. And in that exact moment, there is an impact that happens in the brain, in a very predetermined area of the brain, depending on how one experiences that conflict. And then the corresponding organ that brain control relay is responsible for automatically and instantly starts to make these biological adaptations within that organ. So we have this, what seems to be three separate compartments or components: the brain, the body, and the psyche, is actually one beautiful synchronistic unit that works together. And so in this moment that someone experiences a conflict shock, again, split second moment, the subconscious becomes highly aware, just acutely aware of the entire environment. And it is to record any necessary information to help keep it in the mind, to warn someone in case of a future similar incident or situation that they come upon. And so there are really three categories of tracks: a main track, a secondary track or side track, and then extended tracks. And the main track is always the conflict content itself. So this means that it's best to see this in an example. So Helmut Pilhar used to give the example of a man on a ladder, and he fell off the ladder. So it caught him off guard. He slipped. He was unable to hold and fell. Okay, so in this moment, it meets the 3 criteria to have a DHS and to start a biological program. So caught him on the wrong foot, was acutely dramatic, falling from a height, and then isolated. He was alone in that moment, and so that would constitute for this conflict shock. So in that moment, the content of that itself is established already in the subconscious mind as the main track. So being unable to hold on. So that will manifest in the physical body as muscle weakness, right? And then in the epicrisis will be muscle spasms or a seizure. And so each time in the future that man is on a ladder or sees a ladder, that will, boom, set off this early warning signal, this track, and he will have, without having to have another DHS or conflict about it, he'll re-experience that whole biological program very, very quickly and will have a seizure. And so this is what the main track is. It's the conflict itself. Now, let's say that man completely resolve the conflict and can walk past the ladder fine, can even go on a ladder fine without something reoccurring. That means that the conflict has been resolved, and he's gotten to a point in his subconscious mind, at least, that he can look back at the situation and chuckle, have a good chuckle. Oh my goodness, can't believe that. And there wouldn't be this fear that it could happen again. So let's say he doesn't do that type of work anymore. Maybe he retired and that was his day job, and now he's never going to step foot on another ladder. Well, then again, that could have resolved a conflict and there wouldn't be more tracks and he wouldn't have ongoing seizures. But in a case, just for this example and video explanation, let's say this is his job. This is what he does for a living. And so he is exposed to ladders daily or even weekly. So then you could see how someone would suffer from ongoing seizures, right? And every time this happens, we're unable to connect the dots to what that conflict was. So it's always so helpful if we can understand how a main track is developed and that it's correlated. There's always a correlation to it. So that's the main track. Now, a secondary track, basically, if there's a sensory impression within the environment at that time, that will also be stored in the subconscious mind as, again, another warning signal. So let's stay with this example of a man in the ladder. Let's say he was just having his light lunch and he bit into an apple, and as he was chewing it, he was walking up the ladder. And so he's chewing this apple. He's got this sensory perceptions of sweet and sour in his mouth, and then it happens that he fell. He was unable, he slipped and fell. So the sweet and sour and the apple become the secondary track. So it's not the main track, but it still becomes recorded as a very significant aspect to his experience, to that whole conflict scenario. And so now this man not only has a track to ladders, but now apples. Every time he eats apples or has that really distinguished sweet and sour taste in his mouth from food he eats, he has the same seizure. So the tracks are always pertaining and associated to that main conflict. And the body's response is always going to be the same response to the original conflict, right? So the muscle weakness and then the seizure. So interesting, right? So it just gets to show us the picture now of how things become relatable to the original conflict and how people can be quote unquote allergic to multiple things. So now we can bring in the extended tracks, and extended tracks are developed later on, but are still somehow associated to that main track. So it's so interesting because, or it could be associated to the main track or the secondary track. So let's start with, or continue with, this example of the man. So he's got the apple. So that secondary track is set now in his subconscious mind. And, so maybe this is a completely, it's later, the conflict is done. It's had, not resolved, but he's had this experience. He now is quote unquote allergic to apples and ladders. And let's say he was walking down the street and he seen a kid biting into an apple, and at the same time a dog barked right close by. And so that dog now, the association now is picked up with the dog. Even a ladder, a ladder could be in the view, but doesn't have to be, as long as there's some sort of association to one of the tracks already established. And so now this dog barks, and boom, it's set in his mind now. Not consciously. This is happening all underneath the conscious mind. It's subconscious. And so now a dog, let's say that dog barked and brushed up against his leg. At the same time, he had that whiff of the kid's apple, just in the air. You can smell that crisp apple and that sweet and sourness. So that dog now becomes a track, and not specifically that dog, but a dog in general now. So next time he pets a dog, because he had it, wisp up against his leg, it's associated with that other track of that sweet and sour scent that it's sensory perception that was in the air as he was walking past the kid. So, wow, now all of a sudden there's more to the story, more to this picture about what's causing this man's epileptic seizures that seem to be just getting more and more frequent. But it's because more and more tracks are being established as part of the story. So this is kind of the explanation of how they're developed. The why is, again, it's a warning signal. It's set up to help us. Although it can seem like that's totally contrary to helping us. It's like it's giving us symptoms. How is that helpful? But you see, in our modern age, our modern society, and just the conditioning, we are so distracted in everyday life, where it's often these associations are overlooked so easy because we're not even thinking of this. We're not even trying to connect the dots about, oh yeah, that's a similar thing. That was also part of my experience with the ladder. Like, we're just not taught to do this. And even when we do go sit down to do this is like retraining our brains how to think, because this hasn't been part of our upbringing, is learning to really make correlations, emotional correlations and psychological correlations to what our conflicts have been in life. And so in nature, the animals in nature always avoid tracks. They instinctively know to avoid tracks because, one of my favorite examples was Dr. Hammer's example that he would share about his boxer hound dogs. And his car was stationary, it was parked, and he had two of his boxer hounds in the back seat for a moment, and the back window was partially unrolled. And another dog came, waltzing past this car, and the other dog, one of the male dogs, jumped out to chase this dog, and the female dog went to follow the other dog from inside the back seat, and she got stuck, and she ended up falling right outside the car and broke her hip. And ever since that moment, she would not get back up into that vehicle ever again. And Dr. Hammer even tried coaxing her with putting a piece of meat inside the back door of his car and leaving the door open, and she wouldn't touch it. She still would not get into the vehicle. So it's instinctual for animals. Nature is instinctual. It's just we haven't been taught to really harness this and training our minds to look for these tracks and to begin noticing them, correlating them to the conflict, and then avoiding them if we have to. If the conflict isn't resolved, we will have to avoid them in order to not experience that biological response. For example, the seizure ongoing, right? So that is why it's so important to start training our minds to think biologically in terms of how are these tracks of mine, these so-called allergies, related to conflicts, and start to identify when, like the timelines. Now, this can be difficult for people who've had, chronic conditions. Maybe they were born with them, right? And so something could have happened in utero where a track was developed because of a conflict in utero. And so, how would we begin to correlate that and make changes to that? Well, that becomes a little difficult, but there's still ways we can speak to the subconscious mind to start shifting out of these for whatever isn't relevant anymore. And that if tracks would be helpful to be out of the picture, well, then we can begin speaking to the subconscious mind. And Danny Carroll has developed this system of the bio switch, which is precisely that, is speaking to the subconscious mind to resolve tracks, basically. So yeah, we want to be understand the conflicts. That would be the very first key, is understanding, try to identify that original conflict, and then seeing how that the tracks would have been present, the main track and secondary tracks perhaps would have been present during that experience, and then making that conscious correlation. And oftentimes that's simply all that's required, and boom, that's it. Like it's no longer something we struggle with, whatever the symptom, that recurrent symptom is that is caused by it. And other ways are to write down. So if we can't get to what the original conflict is, well, then begin really keeping an organ symptom or a track symptom, and just making notes throughout the day of when the symptom comes, that recurrent response. It could be, we were talking about in terms of seizures, but you can have anything. People have so many, like, milk allergies these days, right? Or more than just these days, but like, let's just take that for an example. Anytime we have a reaction, let's say it's diarrhea as soon as we have milk. Well, write down, so that milk's a track. But then what happened, right prior to that? What is it that is continuously triggering us? And when was milk part of the story during a conflict? So we're just trying to really flesh out the story, bring everything up to the conscious mind so that it becomes part of our awareness, and we are now acutely aware during the day of what to look for. So if we have this example of milk, for example, and every time we have milk, it just goes through our system and we have a bout of diarrhea, our tracks tell us the way we respond to the track, or the quote unquote allergen, is it tells us how we perceive that conflict. So if it is diarrhea, then we know we had to have had an indigestible morsel conflict, something that angered us. It's just like an upsetting conflict that we just couldn't digest. We couldn't assimilate in that split-second moment. And milk would have been part of that. It would have been in the environment. It could have been as you were just drinking, or had just swallowed a cold glass of milk, or a coffee with milk in it, that you received an upsetting text or a distressing phone call, and that was part of the sensory perceptions, right? And so it all tells the story when we become aware of it, and it makes a lot of sense when we can bring it up to the conscious awareness and have it seen on paper. Look for immediate correlations. This is the other thing, is oftentimes all of our tracks, we don't identify all of, we're not sure about what all of our tracks are. Milk could be a very obvious one, right? The sweet and sour could be, like, and an apple could be very obvious. But what about things that they're not obvious, right? We all of a sudden just have a bout of diarrhea, like this time each week. Every time in the afternoon, we have this bout of diarrhea, and it just seems to be the same time showing up over and over, but there's no really obvious track. Well, this is where keeping that organ symptom is going to be super helpful, because we're looking for immediate correlations, especially emotional correlations in these moments. So, as soon as you had that diarrhea, what happened right before? What was the emotional state? What was going on in the mind? Who are you just talking to? What was the association about? And really start to get clear. And you will see over time that there is a common thread. There's something you can pull on that is the same week after week after week. And it just begins to show you the patterns of how your body's responding every time this emotional correlation comes up, or this specific aspect is apparent. And so, again, bringing it to the awareness, our conscious awareness sometimes is all that's required to see, wow, it's not relevant anymore. Especially if it like brings to mind the original conflict for us, then we're like, oh, of course that was, that's over now. Like that upsetness, let's go with the milk allergy. That upsetness, that phone call that was experienced and that was received by me in that moment, that's long gone. Like that conflict's over, right? But it took her or someone being consciously aware to see that it's not relevant anymore. It doesn't play the role that it once used to. So understanding that tracks were established at the beginning to be of great assistance for us, to warn us for any sort of upcoming possible similar conflicts, that would be warned about it. But over time, similar conflicts, they won't hit us the same way, because we grow, we evolve, we grow in perception and with identity, and we just think differently, right? And so what happened maybe a year ago, we're just a different person now, and we no longer need those same warning signals. But as soon as we bring it to our conscious awareness and make that correlation, it's like, oh, right, okay, yeah, that's great. That could never happen again. Or you could laugh about it and be done with it. And then so the tracks dissolve with you understanding the whole picture, and knowing that something like that could never happen again, or something, exactly the way that happened could never happen again. So avoiding tracks would be the next, very biological solution, is just simply avoiding. So going back to the man on the ladder, maybe it's that he needs to find a different job. I mean, it's easier said than done. It takes, for so many reasons, that's hard to do. That's hard for someone to do, especially if that's their livelihood. But if you know that is going to be, that's the cause, and it's always going to be a conflict, a track, because that's what you do day in and day out. And the seizures are going to be part of your experience until you are finally done with that job. Well, then we have to weigh, is it worth making a career shift or just a job shift to to avoid that track? So these are all things that are available to us. It's just a matter of weighing, what do we want to do? What do we need to do to continue the quality of life that we really want, and in order to avoid the tracks that we possibly can avoid. So hopefully this explanation has been helpful, and maybe it's spurred some insights into why you might be experiencing certain ongoing conditions, or have recognize, oh, yes, there's a reason. I can see the reason why milk would be one of the allergies, because it was apparent in that conflict. There was an association, and it was part of the sensory impressions during that conflict. So just beginning to bring this to awareness, and being open to staying aware of what triggers us is going to be so helpful in and of itself. And the more we can understand these tracks and the roles they play will be beneficial no matter what, even if it just helps us downgrade the experience with the tracks. So just knowing that it's not your body doing something wrong, it's the response, the physical response you get after being exposed to a track isn't your body, making a mistake and malfunctioning. It's there for a purpose. It's biologically encoded to keep you safe, to keep you out of harm's way if there was another situation similar to that. Except um, unlike the animals in nature, we have to learn to listen to our intuition like they do, like their instinctive qualities that keep them away from tracks. They just avoid tracks no matter what, because they instinctively recognize the correlation, the connection they have, and the consequence of what is caused. And so the more we begin to think that way and just show up biologically in that aspect, we too will begin to have a bigger pull on what we experience in life, especially due to these reoccurring conditions. So thank you very much for tuning in. I hope this was helpful. And please reach out if you have any questions, follow-up questions, and join us in the Global GHK Foundation, where there's so many incredible presenters continuously, week after week, presenting incredible content that's really practical as well. And you learn so much. So definitely visit the Global GHK Foundation and sign up to become a member. We'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.